After the release of Cartethyia, I've had a bit of a realization, being that negative statuses, while a cool concept, have been implemented in the most boring way imaginable, and I believe that ultimately, their impact has only been negative. So I wanted to make a video talking about it, first going to talk about every character they gave access to negative statuses, why I think the negative statuses were implemented wrong, and how you could improve it to make it more positive for the game. But let's be so for real, they're not going to change it. So first to talk about every character that they gave access to negative statuses, being first of all Phoebe. I know that Aero Rover technically counts, but Aero Rover's Spectrofrazzle application did not have a single use case before Phoebe's release, so I don't really count them. Aero Rover wasn't designed to have Spectrofrazzle initially, but they slapped it on afterwards because, oh, we need someone who can apply it. Phoebe was designed to be a 2-in-1 unit, being both a DPS that heavily benefits from Spectrofrazzle being on the enemies, as well as a Spectrofrazzle applicant support who's capable of buffing Spectrofrazzle's damage. In a vacuum, this is completely fine. I'd say it's good even, because in theory this would open up two playstyles, one where you focus on Phoebe's own damage, and the other one where you try to do damage with DOTs. But ultimately, Spectrofrazzle's damage output ended up being so horrendous that trying to use Confession Phoebe before Zani's release literally just had no reason to happen. Despite Phoebe's massive buffs for Spectrofrazzle, you were never going to end up using Confession Phoebe, because Spectrofrazzle's damage was so bad at a baseline that no matter how many buffs they gave to Phoebe within reasonable range, Spectrofrazzle's damage was never going to be worth building for. And that left us with Absolution Phoebe. And I'm gonna be honest, I think Absolution Phoebe on release was very well designed. She had access to very accessible teams, with two of her best teams being entirely made up of free-to-play units. She also gave Aero Rover a unique use case. Because Aero Rover is able to heal with their S4, it meant that we were able to use Rover on Rejuvenating Glow, and use Sanhua or Mortefi on your second slot. This made Phoebe a DPS who didn't even use Shorekeeper, something that didn't exist yet. So ultimately, I think Phoebe was a good introduction for negative statuses. Confession Phoebe was sadly a failure. Spectrofrazzle's damage was simply too low at a baseline to be worth building around. And I think that was part of the problem. Absolution Phoebe, while it was well balanced, was a bit boring and underused the Spectrofrazzle mechanic. It was literally just, oh, is Spectrofrazzle on the enemy? Now you do actually good damage. So I think Phoebe as a character was well designed, but as an introduction to Spectrofrazzle, it was a massive failure. Then we got the Aero Rover. Aero Rover was only an air erosion character in name, and in practice, literally did nothing for the mechanic. At release, the only way we could access air erosion was by converting Spectrofrazzle into erosion. And because Frazzle was only applied by Rover and Phoebe, the literal only way air erosion was even possible to proc was if you had both Phoebe and Aero Rover in your team. But obviously, Aero Rover wasn't made to be good on release. They were made purely to be Cartethyia shill, because Cartethyia ended up having mechanics that require more than 3 air erosion stacks. Speaking of which, the increase in the stack cap for air erosion was a very good change in direction when it came to the negative status meta, as it meant that air erosion would actually do a good amount of damage. Or at least significantly better than Spectrofrazzle. It still wasn't amazing, but it was better. And add Ciaccona's damage amplification on top of that after her release, and then suddenly air erosion's damage was actually relevant. Speaking of Ciaccona, I think that she was a way better designed character than Phoebe when it comes to introducing us to the erosion meta. Skipping Zani for a second because I want to talk about her later, Ciaccona actually solved a problem that we had with the current Spectrofrazzle applicators, being the fact that they had absolutely no good multi-wave, and Ciaccona, for this reason, was unique when it came to applying Spectrofrazzle. She also had multiple sources of air erosion application in her kit, meaning you could quite easily reach 6 stacks, which is the maximum cap when you have Aero Rover in your team. Ciaccona also had a really fast rotation. So ultimately, I think that Ciaccona was very well designed. And now we get to Zani and Cartethyia. These are the designated DPS characters for negative status. Phoebe is also a negative status DPS, but clearly Kuro Games wanted her to end up being a Zani support. They just gave her the DPS mode so she had something to do in those 2 patches before Zani's release. But off topic, let's talk about Zani and Cartethyia. I have a lot of problems with Zani, and I also have problems with Cartethyia, although less so. Zani is, in my opinion, one of the biggest failures in game design that this entire game has to offer, which is incredibly impressive. And it comes down to 2 primary things. First of all, the fact that her damage counts as Spectrofrazzle, which is absurd given the fact that Phoebe already amplifies it by 100%, and second of all, the fact that she needs a lot of Spectrofrazzle application to generate Forte. Almost every single mechanic within Zani's kit screams at you to have Phoebe in your team, because if you don't have Phoebe in your team, not only is your damage quite literally getting cut in half, you will also have less Spectrofrazzle application, meaning less Forte and even less damage. And in some scenarios, it even leads to you having less attacks, because your attacks cost Forte. And guess what? Less Spectrofrazzle application means less Forte. Zani's kit design is incredibly baffling to me, because up until this point, characters were incredibly self-sufficient, and did not need another character to function. Sure, Jinshi wanted coordinate attacks for her Forte generation, but there's plenty of characters who have access to coordinate attacks in their kit. Sure, Phoebe also needs Spectrofrazzle, but she doesn't need a certain amount of stacks for it, and also doesn't care about the Spectrofrazzle's own damage. So ultimately, while she is dependent on Rover, literally anyone who can apply Spectrofrazzle will do. But for Zani, she needs both frequent amount of Frazzle application, or at least a lot of it, and also wants amplification for Spectrofrazzle. Zani's attacks counting as Spectrofrazzle damage is honestly diabolical in my opinion, and I think the only reason they did this is because they wanted to experiment how much they could get away with. Zani was already incredibly popular, and they knew that people were going to pull Zani, so they wanted to test out as many stupid ideas as possible before committing to them with Cartethyia. And thankfully, they did learn from Zani, because Cartethyia is, in my opinion, a lot better design. Because unlike Zani, Cartethyia actually utilizes Aero Erosion for the Aero Erosion. But still, Cartethyia has some pretty predatory elements within her kit that I don't like. I'll say this, big plus for Cartethyia to have most of her attacks not count as Aero Erosion. Another plus for Cartethyia, the fact that Aero Erosion damage is actually relevant for her team. That's very good to see. And then another W for Cartethyia is the fact that she is able to apply her own erosion. These are all amazing changes in my opinion, and I would have been very upset if they were not there. But still, I think that it's not amazing, because while Cartethyia does have her own erosion application, it's not actually enough to give your erosion enough stacks to make it worth running, because Fleur-de-Lis actively consumes erosion with certain attacks. So your erosion damage is decreasing more and more over time. And because Ciaccona is your only way of getting it back, you still end up kind of getting locked into a situation where you really want Ciaccona. And because at the very end of your rotation, you still want at least 5 erosion stacks on the enemy, the fact that Fleur-de-Lis drains it over time is just unfortunate to me. So if you paid attention to what I've been saying about Zani and Cartethyia, most of my problems can be summed up in one word: exclusivity. The reason that Spectrofrazzle and Aero Erosion are, in my opinion, predatory mechanics that ended up having a negative impact on the game is because it wasn't available to everyone. They added Spectrofrazzle and Erosion, and they only gave it to very specific characters. So if you do not have these characters, you end up having very little alternatives. And because most characters Kuro Games has been adding recently are 5 stars, scratch that, they've all been 5 stars, These negative statuses end up feeling very predatory, because there's just no free-to-play alternatives, especially in Cartethyia's case. If you don't have Ciaccona for your Cartethyia, guess what you're gonna end up running? Sanhua and Shorekeeper. She straight up just abandons the entire idea of air erosion if you don't have Ciaccona. Because for air erosion application, you literally don't have an alternative. And because the only other Spectrofrazzle applicant is Aero Rover, who has almost no buffs, your Zani ends up feeling way worse without a Phoebe. So how would I fix negative statuses? Simple. Give it to everyone, and just have certain characters that specialize in it more than others. If we gave every character a 10% chance to apply their element-specific DOT on any instance of damage, not only would it give unique utility to characters who are able to apply a lot of damage from off-field or have a lot of multi-hits, it would also give you a lot more alternatives for characters to use with your damage over time characters. We can still have Cartethyia or Ciaccona or Phoebe forced 100% chance to apply the DOT, but giving a limited amount of application to characters who don't specialize in DOT would do no one harm in my opinion. Sure, that doesn't really work for Spectro because Spectro 4 stars, am I right? It would still help a lot with literally every other element. Additional ways of fixing the negative status idea would be by simply making its damage better at a baseline and lowering the amount of amplification that we get from its supports. The reason Phoebe and Ciaccona's amplification buff are 100% is because at a baseline, these effects just don't have a lot of damage output, so you need to giga buff them to make them actually relevant. But if we made the damage a lot better at a baseline, while decreasing the amount of amplification that we get from their supports, it means that for characters like Zani who have their attacks count as a DOT, you ultimately end up relying less on this specific support. But those are just my thoughts. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, check the link in the description to join my Discord. I'm pretty active in there, so there's a pretty good chance I'll respond. If you want to see more of me as a person, be sure to check out my second channel. I just post whatever I feel like over there. But so far it's just been punishing Grey Raven content. But that'll be all from me. Peace.